These were the words Stellan Marsh, the 41-year-old husband of Navia Rena Marsh, said while standing at the edge of her mother's grave, divorce papers folded in the inside pocket of his suit, waiting for the right moment to hand them over. Navia Rena Marsh, the 37-year-old wife of Stellan and the silent majority shareholder of Rena Holdings, the private investment group that quietly owned 62% of Pinnacle North Media Group, a broadcasting and digital platform company valued at $430 million, stood between the grave and the wind, wearing her grandmother's ring and her father's coat, because her mother had died 2 weeks before him and she was still learning how to stand upright. Stellan had said it in a low voice, almost gentle, like he was doing her a favor. "I need someone who can keep up with where I'm going, Navia. I think you know that." Petra Rees, 44, Navia's closest friend since university and the only person outside the trust circle who knew how hollow the marriage had become, was standing 3 feet away. She heard every word. She did not move. Declan Ford, 58, the longtime legal executor of the Renner Family Trust, and the man who had drafted every ownership document Navia's parents had ever signed, stood behind her, with his jaw tight in the way of someone who has spent decades being professional and is finally being asked to fill something against his will. Stellan did not reach for her hand. He reached into his jacket. Navia looked at the papers before he had fully extended them. She recognized the letterhead. She had seen enough legal documents in her life to know what kind of envelope carried an ending inside it. She took them. She did not open them. "You chose today," she said. Stellan's face arranged itself into the expression she had been watching him perfect for the last 2 years. The one that made his feelings look like logic. He said he had waited, as long as was reasonable. He said the timing was what it was. He said her parents would have understood, as though he had known them well enough to speak for them, as though he had not spent the last year of their lives finding reasons to miss Sunday dinners. Behind him, Kristin Solberg, 33, the lifestyle and communications director for Stellan's new podcast network venture, and the reason Navia had stopped sleeping well in October, adjusted the collar of her coat and looked at the grave the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they are waiting to move past. Petra stepped forward. She did not speak to Stellan. She spoke to Kristin. "You came to a burial." Kristin tilted her head with the kind of practiced softness that required a mirror to develop. "Stellan needed support. That's not a crime." Petra looked at her for a long moment. "You're right," she said. "That part isn't." Navia did not watch the exchange. She was looking at the date on the divorce papers. They had been prepared 11 days ago. Her mother had still been breathing 11 days ago. Her father had died 4 days after that, and in the overlap, in that specific and terrible window where Navia had been sleeping in a hospital chair and learning how to lose 2 people at the same time, Stellan had been meeting with a lawyer to formalize his exit. She folded the papers and put them in her coat pocket, next to her grandmother's ring. Stellan said something about timing again, about how he had tried to be considerate, and Navia looked at him the way her mother used to look at people who confused convenience with kindness. "You can go," she said. He went. Kristin went with him, one hand on the small of his back, and the heel of her boot left a small mark in the wet grass at the edge of the grave that Navia would think about for a long time afterward. Declan stayed. Petra stayed. The November wind stayed. Declan placed a sealed envelope beside the flowers on the grave, the kind that had been sitting in his office for years, addressed in Navia's mother's handwriting. "She wrote it last spring," Declan said. "She said you'd know when to open it." Navia touched the envelope. She did not pick it up yet. "Was she afraid this would happen?" Navia asked. Declan considered the question carefully, the way he always did. "Your mother wasn't afraid of things that had already started," he said. "She was only ever afraid of things she couldn't name." Navia Rena Marsh had grown up understanding that money was a language her family spoke quietly. Her father, Bertram Renner, had built Renner Holdings from a regional media consultancy in Winnipeg into one of the most quietly powerful private investment groups in English Canada, not by being loud about it, but by being careful. He had spent 40 years choosing which rooms to enter and which names to keep off public filings. Her mother, Ceciline Renner, had been the company's first editorial director and later its philosophical backbone, the person who reminded the board every year that the reason to own media was not to control narratives, but to protect the ones that would otherwise be crushed. They had raised Navia inside the company the way some parents raise children inside churches, not formally, not loudly, but constantly, so that its values became her instincts before she had words for them. She had been 22 when her father first brought her into a boardroom and introduced her not as his daughter, but as a Renner Holdings observing member. She had understood what he meant. He was telling her to learn before she led. He was telling her that power announced too early became a target. She had never told Stellan the full shape of what she owned, not because she wanted to deceive him. That was not the reason, and she knew it wasn't, but because she had learned from watching her parents that the people who came toward money did not always come toward you. Stellan had known she had family investments. He had known her parents ran a media group. He had seen the name Renner in passing and had not pressed, and she had never volunteered the difference between family investments and controlling stake in a $400 million company. Now she stood in the wind at her parents' graves and understood that the silence had protected nothing, only delayed the test. She drove back to her parents' house alone. Petra followed in her own car, close enough to be visible through the rear window the whole way. The house was the same and entirely different, the way houses become after the people who made them leave. Her mother's reading glasses on the side table, her father's handwriting on a grocery list pinned to the refrigerator, the smell of old wood and the specific soap her mother had used for 30 years. Navia sat at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. Petra made tea she did not ask permission to make and set it in front of her. "Are you going to open it?" Petra said, meaning the envelope. "Not yet," Navia said. "Are you going to call Declan?" "Tomorrow." Petra sat across from her. She did not offer comfort that would have landed wrong. This was one of the things about Petra. She had known Navia long enough to understand that some grief needed to sit still before it would let anyone near it. "He brought her to the grave," Petra said finally. "I know. That wasn't an accident. I know that too." Outside, the maple in the front yard was bare. Her father had planted it the year Navia was born. She used to climb it as a child, and he used to stand below with his arms out, not to catch her but to remind her he was there. She opened the envelope. Her mother's handwriting was the kind that looked unhurried even when it wasn't. "My Navia, if you are reading this, something has happened that made someone mistake your stillness for defeat. I want you to know that I have watched you since you were a girl, and I have never once confused those two things. Your father and I built Renner Holdings the way we did because we believed the people who guard important things should not be the loudest people in the room. We believed that quietly, and we lived it quietly, and we gave it to you the same way. Whatever has been taken from you, by grief, by betrayal, by someone who underestimated what you carry, please remember that Renner Holdings was built to give voice to people who were being silenced. That includes you. Restore what needs restoring. Protect what was never his to touch. The company is waiting for you. Declan knows what to do. I love you enough to have prepared for this." Your mother, Navia, read it twice. Then she folded it along the original crease and held it against her chest, the way her mother used to hold things she wasn't ready to put down. Petra watched her from across the table. "She knew," Navia said. Petra did not ask what she meant. She already understood. The next morning, Navia met Declan in his office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Toronto. The office was exactly as it had always been: dark wood, sealed files, a photograph of her parents from 1991 on the credenza that Declan had never replaced because he saw no reason to. She placed the divorce papers on his desk. Declan looked at them, then at her. "Before we talk about those," he said, "I want you to understand something clearly." He opened a legal file and walked her through it with the patience of a man who had spent 30 years making complicated things legible for people who needed them to be. Renner Holdings was structured so that Navia's controlling interest passed to her outright upon the death of both parents, which had now occurred. The transfer documentation had been prepared and signed in advance. No court action was required, no probate delay. Stellan's name appeared nowhere in the trust structure. The prenuptial agreement he had signed before their wedding, which he had reviewed with independent counsel, and signed anyway on a Tuesday morning, without asking a single follow-up question, confirmed that all Renner family trust assets remained entirely separate. Stellan could not take anything, not through divorce, not through any claim. What he could do, Declan said, was create a different kind of damage. "Tell me," Navia said. Declan turned a page. Over the past 6 months, Stellan's podcast venture, a company called Northbridge Audio, which he had incorporated with 2 partners, his producer Vance Okalik and a digital media strategist named Kristen Solberg, had applied for and received a development grant from Pinnacle North Media Group. The grant was for early-stage audio content development. It was not unusual, Declan explained, except that the application had been submitted under a company name that obscured the connection to Stellan, and the internal approval had been routed through a board member named Graham Ashby, 61, a long-standing director who had been quietly positioning himself as an alternative power center on the Renner board since Bertram's health had declined. The grant amount was $240,000. He applied for funding from a company his wife secretly owned, Navia said. He did not know his wife secretly owned it, Declan said. but Graham Ashby did. Navia looked at the window. Outside, the city continued operating under the assumption that nothing had changed. Graham approved a grant to my husband's company while knowing I controlled Pinnacle North. Yes. Why? Declan's voice was even. Because if Stellan's venture succeeded using Pinnacle North infrastructure and funding, and if that connection became public, it would create a conflict of interest that could destabilize the trust transfer. Graham has been trying for 3 years to shift majority governance away from the Renner line. Navia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who else knows?" Declan placed a second file on the desk. Rona Kell, Pinnacle North's chief financial officer, flagged the application in September. She brought it to me directly. She did not bring it to the board because she didn't know yet how far Graham's reach extended. Rona Kell, 52, was the CFO who had served Pinnacle North for 9 years and who had been hired originally at Cecily Renner's recommendation. She was meticulous, unsentimental, and loyal in the way of someone who had learned early that loyalty was its own form of precision. "She's been holding this for 2 months, Navia said. "She was waiting for you," Declan said. They met Rona that evening in the Pinnacle North offices. The building was quiet at that hour. The editorial floors dark, the lobby staff minimal, the gold-lettered company name on the glass catching the streetlight from outside. Rona spread the documents on the conference table without preamble. Grant application, approval chain, Graham Ashby's signature, Northbridge Audio's incorporation documents, Stellan Marsh's name on the 3rd page. Beside them, she placed a second set of documents, content uploaded to the Northbridge development servers using Pinnacle North credentials, files accessed from the digital archive, broadcast licenses, audience research, advertiser data, format templates that Northbridge had no right to access, and that would have taken years and significant cost to develop independently. Navia looked at the list. "He used the company's internal research," she said. "He built his launch pitch on data from a company he didn't know belonged to his wife." Rona looked at her with the expression of someone confirming a calculation. "Yes." "And Graham facilitated the access. Graham approved the original credential sharing as a courtesy to a grant recipient. The terms he used were broad enough to allow it. I don't think that was accidental." Beside Navia, Petra, who had come because Navia had asked her to, and because she knew how to sit in a room full of hard information without adding noise to it, looked at the credential log and pressed her mouth into a line. Declan said, "We need to move carefully. If we terminate Stellan's access and freeze the grant now, Graham will claim it was a personal marital dispute. He'll say you're retaliating because of the divorce." Rona nodded. "He's been managing that narrative already. He told 2 board members last week that there may be instability in the trust transition because Navia is going through a difficult personal period." The room went quiet. Navia looked at the documents. "He's been setting up the story." "Yes," Declan said. "Which means our response has to be the story." What followed was 2.5 weeks that Navia would later describe. On the rare occasions she described them as the longest she had ever felt, both alone and accompanied at the same time. She moved through the Pinnacle North offices during the day, as she always had, using the side entrance, carrying files, speaking to people with the same measured attention she always had. Most people knew her as a Renner family observer, a consultant presence, the founder's daughter. No one knew yet that the transfer had completed. No one knew that the quiet woman with the old leather portfolio was now the controlling shareholder. Rona knew, Declan knew, Petra knew, and Gideon Ray, 44, Pinnacle North's head of digital security, who had been brought in by Bertram Renner 3 years earlier specifically because he did not confuse access with authority, now knew as well. Gideon had found something else. He brought it to Navia on a Thursday evening in the same conference room with a tablet and the careful voice of a man who had learned to deliver uncomfortable truths without embellishment. Content from Pinnacle North's licensed documentary archive, 6 years of original production, research files, story rights, and interview footage had been copied to an external cloud account linked to Kristen Solberg's professional email. The transfer had occurred in 3 stages over 40 days. The volumes were too large and too targeted to be accidental. Navia looked at the file list. She recognized several of the projects. One of them was a documentary series her mother had personally championed. 3 years in development, 8 subjects, interviewed across 4 provinces, a story about land rights and indigenous journalism that Cecily had believed was the most important thing Pinnacle North had ever agreed to make. She took the land rights documentary files, Navia said. Gideon's face did not change, but something around his eyes did. Yes. Navia sat very still. Until that moment, the betrayal had been about her marriage, her grief, her name. But this reached into something older and larger than any of those things. Her mother had spent 3 years fighting to protect that documentary. She had sat across from board members who said the subject was too narrow, the budget too high, the audience too uncertain, and she had argued every time with the same clear, undiplomatic conviction. Some stories exist to prove that people were here. Ceciline had said at one board meeting that Nevaeh had attended as an observer. If we choose not to tell them, we are choosing to erase them. That is not something I'm willing to do. Now the files sat in Kristin Solberg's cloud account. Nevaeh stood and walked to the window. The city below was lit and indifferent. How many people know about this? She asked. Yumi, Declan, Rona, Gideon said. Let's keep it that way until we're ready. Stellan did not know the walls were moving. He conducted his week the way he had been conducting the last year of his life, with the energy of a man who believed he was building something without anyone checking his blueprints. He recorded 3 episodes of his podcast. He attended a digital media launch party where a photographer caught him laughing with Kristin and a senior producer from a competing network. The photo circulated quietly in industry circles, attached to language about new chapters and creative independence. A journalist named Blythe Sherwood, 38, who covered media industry trends and had connections to Pinnacle North's communications team, published a short item noting that rising podcast entrepreneur Stellan Marsh had quietly separated from his wife, following what sources described as a long-term incompatibility. The item mentioned that Stellan was now associated with Kristin Solberg, described as a key creative partner. It did not mention Nevaeh by name. Rona brought the article to Nevaeh with the same expression she used for flagged expenses. It was placed, Rona said. Blythe Sherwood has received 2 paid media placements from Northbridge in the last 3 months, listed as consulting fees. Nevaeh read the article. She had been described, without being named, as someone who had held Stellan back from his potential. She placed the article in the evidence file without speaking. Petra, who had arrived that morning with coffee and had stayed, read it over Nevaeh's shoulder. He's shaping the public version before you can speak, Petra said. I know, Nevaeh said. He learned how to do that at Pinnacle North. He sat in 3 of our communication strategy sessions in 2021. I invited him. The room was quiet for a moment. You're not going to let that make you feel responsible, Petra said. It was not a question. No, Nevaeh said, but I'm going to remember it. The Pinnacle North annual showcase was held every December in the main theatre of a performing arts centre in downtown Toronto. 200 seats, board members in the centre rows, industry partners along the sides, streaming executives and media journalists filling the back third. It was the event where Pinnacle North presented its upcoming slate. New series, documentary commitments, format acquisitions, creative partnerships. This year, it was also quietly the event where the formal ownership transition would be announced. Declan had recommended it. Rona had agreed. Gideon had reviewed the security of every digital system that would be used that evening. The announcement would come from the company, in the company's name, with board documentation already filed and outside counsel already cleared. What else would come first was the question Nevaeh had spent 11 days answering with everyone in the room. The financial records connected to the Northbridge grant, the application, the approval chain, Graham Ashby's signature, the credential access logs, the cloud transfers, would be presented as a formal corporate disclosure. Outside counsel had reviewed every document. The Ethics Committee of the Pinnacle North Board, chaired by a director named Lena Morrow, 66, who had known Bertram Renner for 25 years and who ran her committee with the precision of someone who believed that process was the only real protection an institution had approved the disclosure. What would follow was the ownership announcement. What would come last, if at all, if Nevaeh decided it belonged there, was the cemetery recording. Gideon had captured it because he had seen a freelance photographer near the burial who had no apparent connection to the Renner family, and because he understood that whatever was said at a grave might later be described differently by someone with a reason to describe it differently. He had given Nevaeh the file. He had not told her what to do with it. She watched it once, alone, late at night in her parents' house. Stellan's voice, the wet grass, her own back in the frame, the coat, the grandmother's ring she had forgotten she was wearing. I need someone who can keep up with where I'm going. She closed the laptop. The next morning she called Declan. Use the business case first, she said. All of it. Every record. Let the company speak before I do. The personal material only if the character evidence is necessary to explain the pattern and only authenticated. Nothing that can be reframed as a grieving woman making it personal. Declan said, and the cemetery recording? Nevaeh looked at her father's coat on the back of the chair. Last, after the evidence. So people understand what kind of man was capable of what kind of records. She called Stellan the night before the showcase. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting it. Nevaeh. His voice had the particular quality it had developed over the last 18 months, a warmth on the surface, a door just behind it. "I wanted you to know I'm attending tomorrow," she said. A pause. "The showcase? I didn't think that was really your." "It is now," she said. Another pause. She could hear him deciding how to read this. He landed, she could tell, on the interpretation that she was coming to be visible, to remind people of her connection to the Renner name before it faded into the past. "I think that's fine," he said, in the voice of a man generously allowing something. "I know," she said, and ended the call. The night of the showcase, Navia entered through the main building entrance. She wore a charcoal dress and her grandmother's ring, and her father's watch beneath her sleeve, and her mother's pearls at her throat, all four things at once, because she did not know another way to bring them with her. Declan walked beside her. Rona followed. Petra was already inside. Gideon moved through the building separately, checking the projection system, the security staffing, the badge logs at every entrance. No one announced her when she walked in. No cameras turned. The room had filled with the particular energy of an industry event. The ambient noise of people who were all professionally interested in each other, champagne glasses making soft sounds, conversations about pilots and acquisition deals, and the state of digital advertising. Stellan was near the center of the room. He was wearing the suit she recognized from the photograph with the journalist. Kristin stood beside him in a way that was not accidental, her hand near his arm without quite touching it, the careful geography of someone managing an image. Vance O'Callagh, 39, Stellan's producer partner, stood a few feet away talking to two platform executives. He had the slightly too careful posture of someone monitoring multiple conversations at once. Graham Ashby stood at the edge of the board section, holding a drink and watching the room with the assessment of a man who believed he understood all the moving pieces. He did not see Navia come in. Stellan did. He looked at her across the room, and she watched his face move through surprise and land on composure. He raised his glass slightly, a social acknowledgement designed to look gracious. Navia looked at him long enough for the acknowledgement to complete, and then looked away. She found Orin before the program started. His name was Orin Bozalale, 27, a documentary researcher who had worked with the Pinnacle North production team for 14 months before the Northbridge grant had been approved, and whose original field research, conducted over 2 years, had formed the structural basis of the land rights documentary now sitting in Kristin Solberg's cloud account. He had brought his concerns to 3 different people inside the company, before Rona had finally told him to hold the documentation and not discuss it further. He had done so for 9 weeks. He was standing near the side wall, holding a press folder against his chest, the way people hold things they're afraid to put down. Navia crossed the room to him. "You've been waiting a long time," she said. "I thought I'd waited too long," Orin said. His voice was steady but not easy. "You didn't." He looked at her for a moment. "What happens tonight?" "The company says what the company did," she said, "and then you get your name back." The lights dimmed. Lena Morrow took the stage first, which was not the expected order. People registered the change, but did not know what to do with it. Lena was known for her precision and her economy of expression, and she stood at the podium with both of those qualities present. Before this evening's slate presentation, Pinnacle North Media Group has a formal statement to make on behalf of the board, in accordance with the Ethics Committee's disclosure mandate. The room shifted. Stellan's glass stopped moving, the screen behind Lena lit with a document, clean white background, official seal. The Ethics Committee's approval date in the corner. The first item was the Northbridge Audio Grant application. Application date. Approval date. Graham Ashby's signature. The concealed corporate connection to Stellan Marsh. $240,000. Graham Ashby stood up. "This is being mischaracterized," he said. "This was a standard development grant." Lena looked at him with the patience of someone who had expected this and had already decided not to find it interesting. "Mr. Ashby," she said, "you'll have the opportunity to respond to the Ethics Committee in the formal process beginning tomorrow. Please sit down." He sat. He looked at the room for support and found faces that would not meet his eyes. The screen changed, credential logs, the dates, the volumes, the Pinnacle North data accessed through the grant-related credentials, the audience research, the advertiser data, the format templates, then the documentary files, the file names, the dates of transfer, the cloud account linked to Kristin Solberg. Stellan put his glass down. The screen changed again. The land rights documentary project. Ceciline Renner's name in the production file, listed as executive champion. The original field research. Orin Bozalale's name, dated 2 years before any Northbridge activity. Someone near the back of the room made a sound that was not quite a word. Stellan was staring at the screen. Navia watched him look at her mother's name, and she watched something move across his face that she could not entirely read. Not guilt, maybe, but some recognition of a scale he had not accounted for. He turned toward Navia in the dim light. She looked back at him steadily. The screen changed. Audio filled the theater, not music. Wind, grass, the sound of a November cemetery, then Stellan's voice. "I need someone who can keep up with where I'm going." And her own voice, quiet, not crying. "You chose today." Then his, "Your parents aren't here anymore to ask you to stay, Navia."
I think you know what I mean.
The theater was silent in the way of a room that is not sure what sound would be appropriate. Kristin looked at the floor. Vance turned his face toward the exit door. Graham Ashby sat with his hands folded on his knees like a man reviewing whether his choices had been worth this. The last document appeared. Formal corporate disclosure. Renner Holdings. Controlling entity of Pinnacle North Media Group. Majority beneficial owner and active chair, Navia Renner Marsh. The room turned slowly, the way rooms turn when they are being reoriented. Stellan looked at her. His expression had passed through several things and arrived at something she had never seen on him before. It was not anger. It was the particular shock of a person who realizes they have been walking through a house for years without understanding whose house it was. He said her name, just her name. Navia walked to the front. She did not move quickly. She moved the way her father had moved, with the particular economy of someone who has nothing to prove. She stood at the podium. She looked at the room, not at Stellan. "My parents built Renner Holdings and Pinnacle North Media Group on a single principle," she said, "that the people best equipped to guard important stories should not be the loudest people in the room. They lived that principle. They passed it to me the same way." She turned slightly toward the documentary project file still on the screen. Pinnacle North is opening a formal investigation into the Northbridge audio grant, the associated credential access, and the unauthorized transfer of production materials, including the land rights documentary project currently in development. All related accounts are under hold pending outside review. Graham Ashby's board access is suspended effective tonight, pending the ethics committee process. Lena Morrow nodded once from her seat. The land rights documentary will proceed under its original development terms. Orin Beausoleil's field research will be credited correctly, and the production will be protected until it is complete. Orin was sitting near the side wall. He had both hands pressed flat on his thighs. Someone near him started clapping, uncertain, then a few more, and then the back of the room, and then most of it. Not the kind of applause that belonged to Stellan's name on a promotional poster, but the kind that belonged to something that had been put right. Stellan did not move through the applause. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the stage, and looked at his wife, and looked at the screen where his voice had just played. And Navia thought he might finally be understanding the difference between a room that approved of him and a room that remembered who had built it. She looked at him from the podium, and she did not look away. "I have spent 4 years in this building as Stellan Marsh's wife," she said. "Not as a statement of anger, as a statement of fact. I am not standing here as his wife tonight. I am standing here as my parents' daughter." She stepped back from the podium. The room was still absorbing it when Declan approached Stellan with the envelope. Formal notice. Executive relationship termination with Pinnacle North effective immediately. Northbridge Audio's grant suspended, funds to be returned, investigation pending. Outside counsel would be in contact regarding the data access and transfer. Vance O'Callagh received an envelope. Kristin Solberg received one from Rona, who delivered it with the expression of someone completing a task that had been waiting an appropriate amount of time. Blythe Sherwood, the journalist, sat 2 rows back with her phone in her hand and the look of a person reassessing what story she was actually covering. Stellan took the envelope from Declan. He looked at it the way people look at things when they are trying to decide if they are real. Then he looked at Navia. "You could have told me," he said. His voice was lower than it had been, smaller. "I could have," she said. "And you could have asked who I was instead of deciding what I was worth. We both made our choices." She left the stage. In the weeks that followed, the investigation moved the way careful investigations move, steadily, without drama, with the weight of documentation behind it. Graham Ashby resigned from the board before a formal removal vote could be scheduled. Vance O'Callagh cooperated with outside counsel and accepted a reduced settlement. Kristin Solberg returned the documentary files through legal intermediaries and did not contest the access violation findings. The article that had described Navia, unnamed, as someone who had held Stellan back was retracted by the publication after its provenance. Paid placement, Northbridge funds, became part of the public record. Stellan's podcast launch did not collapse, it contracted. The Pinnacle North funding was gone. The Pinnacle North data was gone. What remained was what he had built independently, which was smaller and more honestly his than he would have preferred it to be. Orin Beausoleil's name appeared in the documentary's official credit documentation the morning after the showcase. He called Navia to say thank you and cried for approximately 45 seconds before he regained his composure and apologized for it. She told him there was nothing to apologize for. The land rights documentary began its final production phase in January. Navia started using the main entrance of the Pinnacle North building, not because anyone asked her to, and not because anything announced it, but because there was no longer a reason to come through the side. The first morning she walked through the front door, the security guard, a man named Frank, who had worked the lobby desk for 11 years, and who had seen Navia come and go hundreds of times without knowing who she was, looked up from his desk and nodded at her with the particular nod of someone who has recently received a piece of information that has recontextualized many things. "Good morning, Ms. Renamarsh," he said. "Good morning, Frank," she said, and went to her office. She stood at the window for a long moment before sitting down. The city below was doing what it always did, unaware of most of what happened inside the buildings that made up its skyline. On her desk was her mother's letter, worn soft at the fold now, from how many times she had opened and refolded it. Beside it was her father's old company key, the one he had pressed into her palm in the original Renner Holdings office when she was teen, and told her that power should never be the first thing people love about you. She had spent years making sure it wasn't. She pulled the key toward her and held it for a moment. Then she set it down, opened her laptop and began. "Some women are not built for quiet corners. Some women build the building."